As a business owner or manager, dealing with a personal grievance can feel overwhelming, especially when you're trying to do the right thing by your team and your business. In this episode, our HR partner, People and Culture, shares some practical advice on what to do when a complaint lands and how to follow a fair process and how to avoid those common mistakes. Kia ora, I'm Carolyn Young, Chief Executive of Retail NZ, and today I'm joined by Melanie Marks, who's the co-founder of People and Culture. Kia ora and welcome.
Thanks, Carolyn.
Sometimes it's really difficult when you're managing staff, right? And personal grievance is that word that really kind of gets your antenna up if you're a manager or a business owner. So when a personal grievance is first raised, what are the most important first steps a retail store owner should take to respond appropriately?
Yeah, and they definitely do raise the hair on the back of your neck when one does come through. And there are a number of steps that you do need to cover. And I will try and summarize them today. I think the first point that I would say is that acknowledge the grievance promptly. So don't ignore it and hope it will go away, or equally go on the defensive. It's really important that you acknowledge at least that you've received it. You don't need to fully respond straight away, but acknowledge that you've received it. Just a quick email saying, thank you for raising this concern. We take this seriously. We'll review the matters that you've raised and we will respond in due course. A simple email like that, just to acknowledge you've received it, is all that's needed in the first instance. Then I think the second thing you want to get really clear on is understanding exactly what the employee is alleging. So some really common ones include bullying and harassment, unsafe work practices, unjustified dismissal. So you can ask for clarification, but avoid going into too much detail at this point, but really clarify what it is they're actually alleging has happened. This third thing that's important is looking at what evidence you might have and looking to secure that evidence. So I know in retail environments, there's often CCTV that gets, wiped, on a certain time frame, and that can quickly disappear if you haven't preserved it. So thinking about what you need to preserve as evidence from your perspective. So like I said, CCTV footage, emails, text messages, notes, things that you've got that you can start gathering from your perspective as the employer. The other thing is, thinking about whether you need to speak with any other staff. Has anyone else, witnessed if it's a bullying allegation, for example, and ideally getting some formal statements with a note there that, that needs to be done carefully in terms of witness statements. They are, a key part of the process, but you'd be wise to seek advice at this point, with a specialist like us on how to take those witness statements, because there is quite a lot of procedural detail that's important there. So that would be a key piece there to think about. Considering any immediate risk management. So, for example, we're talking about an example of bullying, or whether there's something along the lines of theft, health and safety concerns, or threats that are involved. What temporary measures you must think about in terms of keeping people safe. So can you adjust shifts? Do you need to separate employees? Can you give them an alternative reporting line? Or do you need to think about paid suspension? Again, a note on that, there is a process around paid suspension. We'd advise getting advice if you're thinking about suspending someone, because again, that can bring risk into your process if you don't do that properly. So the final point here, when you first get that grievance through, is to avoid taking any disciplinary action before you investigate. Seek advice early, and also check your employment agreements and company policies to make sure you're following your own processes too.
And so, I guess that leads us into thinking about, what would a fair and legally sound process look like if you're, investigating, responding to a personal grievance in your store?
Yeah, so New Zealand employment law doesn't expect employers to be perfect, but it does expect them to act fairly and reasonably in all of the circumstances. So what that means in real terms is that you need to follow a fair and reasonable process. So I thought I'd just step through the high level process there. But our advice would be, if you're not comfortable running an investigation, don't try and do it yourself, because sometimes even if you have an outcome that would have potentially been fair, if you have issues with your process, that can be the undoing in and of itself.
And I guess, just to interrupt for a second, Melanie, it's just that just because you're uncomfortable doing the investigative process doesn't mean it shouldn't be done, right? It's just about finding the right people to do it for you, so that and sometimes it's actually better to get somebody else in, right? Because then it can be seen to be independent rather than coming from a position of bias.
Definitely. And I think it also protects both parties. It protects you as the employer, and it protects the employee, and they can see that this is being done in a procedurally fair way when you bring someone independent in. So just high level in terms of, what that looks like is already touched on. We need to be clear on what the issues are, what exactly the allegation is, who's involved, and if the employee is already asking for an outcome, what that is, and separate fact from opinion. This is where you want to think about, is a formal investigation needed, or can you do this internally? So you'll know based on what the allegation is whether probably you want someone more independent, or whether it's a more lower level and you're happy to manage it yourself if you've got some experience there and you're impartial enough, so you're not someone that's being an allegation against. But we would recommend for smaller retail businesses an external person or investigator such as us would be appropriate when you don't have that experience. Then you're going to be gathering information. So good practice looks like advising people of meetings, allowing them to bring support people, taking notes, remaining neutral, fact-finding. You're not at that stage trying to prove if someone's right or wrong. You're just gathering the information that you need. And then when you do have all of the information you need, you're inviting to meetings, giving the appropriate notice to attend those meetings, having everything documented, and giving the employee a chance to respond. So that looks like the employee knowing the allegation against them, receiving all the relevant information, and having a genuine opportunity to comment on that. So those are the most important legal requirements. But we're making findings based on your evidence. So what's been established, what is not established, any mitigating factors, and then communicating the outcome. So having a clear outcome, what was investigated, what was found, what action you're taking. Sometimes you can't share all of that information with everyone involved, depending on privacy, and every situation is different. But, and definitely the person that's had the allegation against them, they need to have a clear outcome to the investigation. And some, people often think of formal disciplinary action, but you can also think about things, depending on what the situation is, around, could it be mediation to resolve it? If there's a conflict between people, is it further training or coaching that's needed? Or are your policies unclear? A lot of the time we see people just aren't clear on the rules. So yes, you think it's obvious that a rule's been broken, but have you actually been clear on what those rules are? So sometimes that's an outcome of these types of matters. It's like, oh gosh, we actually need to put some clearer processes in place and communicate those so everyone understands them. And then finally, follow up. So if the people are remaining in the workplace and you've resolved the issue, then monitor those relationships. Ensure that those agreed actions are actually implemented. So many grievances re-emerge because employers have failed to follow through with what they said they were going to do or what those outcomes said. So that follow-up is a really important step there. So I guess the key point here is, don't underestimate what's involved in conducting a workplace investigation. There's a lot of moving parts, and getting the process wrong can actually undermine what might otherwise have been a justified outcome. So a legally fair investigation takes planning, good judgment, a solid understanding of the law. It's not just about asking a few questions and making a decision. It's about following a process that's fair and reasonable and well documented and communicated.
So really important not to have a preconceived idea about what the outcome might be, but just to really focus on that first step that you've got to do. As you mentioned, there's lots of things that you need to cover, but what's the first thing you need to do? Do that, do it well, do the next step, and base each step based on what you've found out from the prior investigation or conversations or, any of those pieces that you've looked at. And so I think, when we think about that, that's sometimes hard to do. What other sort of common mistakes are there that, a retailer might do when trying to handle a personal grievance? And how could they avoid, the situation escalating?
Yeah, so I think the most common one we see is people getting on the defensive and seeing it as a personal attack. But a better approach is to really treat it as a process issue that requires investigation, not a challenge to your authority or your character. The one you've touched on already, Carolyn, was making a decision before you investigate. So, thinking, oh, Sarah wouldn't do that, or that's just John, he's always complaining. So anything that's predetermined can create significant legal risk. So you must keep an open mind until all your evidence and investigation is collected and completed. And just on that, failing to document things. So a lot of the time people will come to us and say, we've had this conversation months ago, talked about this, but if there's no record, it becomes difficult to prove. So I always say if it wasn't documented, it didn't happen. So your better approach is to keep good notes of meetings, concerns, any outcomes, informal chats and decisions as they happen.
Yeah, so that's well before a personal grievance, right? So it means that if something occurs, you've got those notes to fall back on.
Correct. I think also not providing information. So when you're in an investigation or you're at the point of having a formal meeting, is maybe some people withholding evidence because maybe they think they want to put the employee on the back foot through introducing, kind of surprise evidence in a formal meeting. But it's really procedurally unfair. Anything that you're relying on to make a decision, you have to provide to the employee before the formal meeting to give them a fair opportunity to digest it and respond to it. So you really have to follow natural justice requirements there. So that's a big mistake we see. Another one is suspension and using it as like a punishment or an automatic response to a grievance that comes through. So in retail, sometimes we see employers just sending someone home immediately without considering alternatives. So you really only can suspend when there's a genuine business reason to do so, such as a safety risk or interference with evidence you're worried about or a risk to any investigation. So that's a really big one as well. And there is a process that you have to follow before you suspend someone as well. So we'd recommend getting advice on that if you're thinking of suspending someone, and to check your employment agreements as to what it says about suspension. The practical advice for retail owners I would give when you get a grievance is to stay calm, acknowledge the concern, preserve any evidence, investigate objectively, follow natural justice, document everything, and seek advice before making any significant decisions. So as I said at the beginning, most personal grievances are not, won because the employer was perfect. They're won because the employer can demonstrate they followed a fair, reasonable process.
Look, thank you so much for joining us today, Melanie. A personal grievance process is really complex and complicated, and it is so important to, take each step as you can in front of you and seek support and advice to help you through that process. It's been such a pleasure to speak to you today to hear more about people and culture and how they can assist retail businesses with things like a personal grievance.
Yes, thanks, Carolyn, and we look forward to helping some of your members with things when they come through.
Look, I hope everyone enjoyed this episode, and don't forget to visit peopleandculture.co.nz. So it's peopleandculture.co.nz to find out more. This was part of our Empowering Retail series, your go-to resource for short, actionable insights to take your business to the next level. Until next time, ka kite anō. Bye for now.